It's my pleasure to introduce Sandra Weems, Dr. Sandra Weems, who PhD, who's an adjunct lecturer at the University of Florida. And her work explores the uses of writing and narrative as healing modalities in clinical and other therapeutic settings. Her research interests include traumatology, poetry therapy, and literature in medicine. In 2010, she helped design and teach an interdisciplinary narrative medicine course for English graduates and medical students at UF. Currently, she's revising her dissertation, The Poetics of Healing, Voicing Illness and Trauma in Literature, Reflective Writing, and Narrative Medicine into book form, and is planning to edit an anthology of the writings of WHR Rivers, MD. Her talk and the series is brought to you in part by the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere, National Network of Libraries of Medicine, and also with help from Dr. Paulette Hahn and Dr. Pamela Gilbert. And the talk today is titled Relieve the Press of Ideas and Rest Me, Reflective Writing in the Yellow Wallpaper. I'd also like to remind people, please feel free to help yourself to food and also to complete one of the green forms, which is just our little survey for the talk. But with all that said, welcome, Dr. Weems.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. I'm truly thrilled to be here to talk to you today back at my old stomping grounds, my old alma mater, to talk to you about something that's really near and dear to me. Two things, really, literature and reflective writing. So I'll pause a bit over the title and the quote that I chose from the Yellow Wallpaper. Relieve the press of ideas and rest me. What's significant about that is that that is both the aim and the outcome of reflective writing. It is a type of writing, as we'll see, that aims to help the writer sort through chaotic thinking, stressful times, traumatic memories, and so forth, and to give them some relief. So, just briefly, I'll return to this at the end. What is reflective writing? Well, first and foremost, it is autobiographical narrative. No matter what form we see it in, it has autobiographical elements to it. Obviously, if it's trying to relieve the press of ideas for the writer is naturally writing about oneself. And we know that the Yellow Wallpaper is, in large part, an autobiographical story. Perkins Gilman, I think I'll just say Gilman, she wrote an article some years later after the publication of the story that said, that was titled, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And she cautioned us not to take it too literally, that not everything in the story was autobiographical. She said, I didn't have hallucinations and I had no problem whatsoever with my wallpaper. But it is indeed a story of her sort of descent into this state of mental desperation, this very black depression. So we will look at elements of emotional self-disclosure in the story. One of the components of reflective writing is that it enables the writer to speak about emotions that may be suppressed for some other reason. It's a kind of venting, in psychological terms, abreaction or a release that leads to some kind of catharsis. It's a method of externalizing, of getting all those pent-up frustrations or emotions out onto paper into black and white print so that you can deal with it better. And it's a method of problem solving too, because when we story ourselves, when we put our fears, frustrations, anxieties into a narrative form, we are learning things constantly. The writing teaches us. Whether we intend for it to or not, it just happens that way. We learn from what we write in these kinds of writing sessions. And reflective writing is also of course, a framework of meaning that helps the writer understand a frightening experience. And this is certainly true for this work of fiction. It did indeed help Gilman understand the kind of threat that was posed by this kind of illness that she had, and also the great fear of not being understood or believed by her own physician at that time. So Gilman herself lived from 1860 to 1935, and this photo was taken in 1884, right before she got married, a couple of months before she got married. And Gilman's troubled relationship with marriage, the idea of marriage, is something I think that is quite evident in most of her writings. She, hemmed and hawed and really waited and put off Walter Stetson, her first husband, before accepting his proposal. And she said things like, in her diary, she anticipated a future of failure and suffering, and that the children would be always sickly and unhappy, and the husband miserable because of my distress. And she wrote with a long dash in her diary, as if it was this abyss or this just open-ended question, what will I be in the state of marriage? She had some success as an author right before she got married. I think that kind of increased her anxiety a bit, because she knew with the Victorian conventions of marriage that she was entering a state in which she would have to give over the writing to the domestic chores and duties of a wife. But she was nevertheless, even before and after her marriages, very prolific writer, a lecturer, a reformer. She was a suffragette, and a very vocal feminist, way ahead of her time, I guess, in that respect, and unpopular with the traditional Victorian viewpoints of some women and men. But she wrote about 28 large volumes worth of work. So that's a substantial amount of writing for one life, and for any life. And the remarkable thing about it is, in terms of reflective writing, is that through much of the reform work that she tried to instigate, you can see that she's working through her own kinds of frustrations and indignations, her own limitations in the Victorian sphere. She was wildly energetic, although as a young lady in her teens, she had some severe depressive episodes. These are recorded in her diaries, but also through family writings as well. Nevertheless, she had this profound desire to work and to commit herself to altruistic causes. Some of her favorite words were work and living and purpose. Actions or qualities that kind of all denote some kind of out of the ordinary sphere activity for a Victorian woman. This picture was taken in 1887, and as Cynthia Davis, who spoke here last week, wrote in her biography, she said that when Gilman saw this portrait, she said, "This is what my breakdown did to me." She does look sadder. Her eyes look steelier. Her jaw is more set. She looks different from the earlier photo. And another thing Davis said is that the experience of her first marriage convinced her that loving was not simply the opposite of living, but its opponent. So it's kind of hard to imagine that you set up living and loving as opposites or opponents, you know. But to work or to have a husband, you know, she's just saw the two as completely incompatible. And, you know, other women writers struggled with this, like Virginia Woolf, one of her contemporaries, who incidentally also underwent this enforced rest cure as part of her, you know, treatment for her mental illness. But Virginia Woolf was happily married and saw ways of, you know, balancing the loving and the living. But I bring that quote up because Gilman seemed to like to set up these binaries in her writing, and there are certainly several of them in the Yellow WallPaper. For instance, we can think of the binary of wife-husband. And as a binary, we don't necessarily have to think opposite. We can think the relationship or the dichotomy, you know. But there is a definite dynamic of the wife and husband that she's exploring in the Yellow WallPaper that she certainly experienced in her life. The domestic troubles that the narrator of the Yellow WallPaper experiences are conflated with the patient troubles that the narrator experiences, and both in this case are invalidated. The mother-father dynamic, this binary, it's almost completely absent. We get so very little of her feelings as a mother, or, you know, John's feelings as father, even though we read the story as an account of postpartum depression, typically. In fact, Gilman directly linked her own childbirth to this episode of major depression. She said that this agony of mind set in with the child's coming. I nursed her in slow tears. And she would again and again return to these kinds of topics: motherhood, childhood, the imprisonment of domesticity in her writings later in life. So I've excerpted some bits of the text itself just to explicate these binaries as we go through, with the understanding that the binaries she sets up are all part of her exploring this emotional disclosure side of reflective writing. She's trying to work through something very much in the story. She had just recently divorced Walter Stetson and said she wrote the Yellow WallPaper quickly, like in 2 days. But she's definitely working something out in fiction/autobiography in these pages. The story says, John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. And just a little note of interest, that phrase "in marriage" has all but disappeared from subsequent editions of the text. If you are looking at an anthology published today, that phrase probably doesn't exist there. And scholars are wondering, was that an authorial decision or was that an editorial decision? Did some editor somewhere along the line decide to take that out? I bring it up because it was in the original story, and it seems to, you know, be sort of a bit of a jab, a little indictment of marriage in this this sentence of her husband laughing at her. But if you remove it, it does kind of leave it mysterious. And why does one expect that one's husband should laugh at you, you know? But John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. He is a man of science. He is very much a Victorian man of science. And in describing him this way, Gilman is almost setting him up as a figure in a horror genre. Just the couple of previous sentences, she's talked about the house perhaps being haunted. And so when the reader comes to the story, we really don't know what to expect, what's going to happen. But in describing him this way, she over-determining him? Is she saying, oh, he's, too rigid and has no feeling? Well, let's hold off and think about that for a second when we come to the character that she's conflating John with, and that is her physician, Silas Weir Mitchell. So another textual binary, obvious in this text, the patient-doctor binary. The narrator or the patient's understanding of her condition is constantly belittled or dismissed. We get the feeling that practical John is not interested in entertaining any of the notions of depression or illness that his wife is bringing to him. She lacks trust and understanding in him, and he lacks trust and understanding of her condition. And he is constantly infantilizing her. This is interesting, I think, throughout the story, especially when we look where the story takes place, in a nursery, right? He's constantly calling her silly goose and talking about her in the third person. Oh, she'll be as ill as she pleases, calling her little girl, etc. He is, sort of, we're meant to believe in the story, forcing her to regress into this sort of childhood state. John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper, significant, and a great relief to my mind, significant. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick, and what can one do? Again, here is the conflation of her own relationship with Walter Stetson and the physician, Silas Weir Mitchell. And it's extremely important to her, or was important to Gilman, that Weir Mitchell understood and believed in her illness, because she truly did feel like she was losing her mind. But she ran into some opposition. She wrote him an extensive letter before she went to Philadelphia to take this rest cure, and she gave a complete etiology and pathology, as she saw it, of her condition, and tried to explain what she was feeling and what she was going through. And apparently he was not moved. He was not very sympathetic, as some scholars have noted, probably because he had been dealing with this kind of patient for years, and he saw it as, he said, self-conceit, this letter. So that Weir Mitchell and Gilman kind of butted heads a little bit from the very beginning, even before she got to the sanitarium. But here he is. He was, at the time, the most renowned nerve specialist in the U.S., did really important work after the Civil War with phantom limbs, and wrote extensively about that. But he is the one who introduced this rest cure, or as he called it, the Weir Mitchell treatment. And he wrote a book about it called Fat and Blood, which was intended for the less experienced physician to understand this type of treatment that he had introduced. And he suspected that menstruation and childbirth left women more thin-blooded than men, and thus more susceptible to disease. So part of the rest cure that comes from seclusion, seclusion is part of no outside stressors, remove the patient from the environment in which she is feeling these debilitating symptoms, put her in isolation for all intents and purposes. The special diet was overfeeding and lots of fatty foods. It was literally hand feeding. The nurses fed the patients. Sometimes he would allow the nurses to cut up meat and so forth so that the patients could feed themselves. But it was more often the case that they were hand fed. By total bed rest, we do mean total bed rest. He says in this book that he even wanted the bowel movements and the water to be done while in bed. And then the nurses would sponge off the patient and lift her out of bed and sponge her off and change the sheets and put the patient back. So this is what we mean when we say sort of infantilizing her. You're really taking away all agency whatsoever, not allowing the patient even to turn herself over in bed. The nurses would do that too. And along with that came massage and electricity. I think the electricity was meant to supplement the massage and to keep the muscles from atrophying. But oddly enough, Gilman seemed to rather enjoy and get a little bit better when she was at the sanitarium undergoing this treatment. To me, it sounds it sounds terrible. I couldn't do it for 5 minutes, but she enjoyed the respite from the domestic duties that she had come to abhor, and she kind of got a little bit better. But there was still the clashing with Weir Mitchell, who reportedly openly disparaged her writing, and she was drafting an article, for instance, and told him about it in one of their sessions, and he he made a very insulting comments about it, about the uselessness of this task. Oops. There we go. And as he wrote in his next book, his attitude about some of his patients really does come through. It seems, remarkable in our 21st century thinking, I guess, that he would write some of the things that he wrote about female patients. But we have to consider his context. He was very much the traditional Victorian and very much a noted physician of his time. So she did well with the rest cure, but then this was the prescription, the famous prescription that she was sent home with. Live as domestic a life as possible. She hated that, we know. Have your child with you all the time. She said merely dressing her baby would cause her to shake and weep. Lie down an hour after each meal. That comes straight from the story, or it goes straight into the story, I should say. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. And that is completely antithetical to what we know of with reflective writing. Reflective writing is meant to allow you to get back in touch with your pen and express yourself whenever, however you can. Now, of course, Gilman would never have known the phrase reflective writing, but she certainly felt this visceral need to write. So as we see in the story and in much of her own nonfiction writing. She's very much undone by this prescription. Never touch pen again. So back to the story and this sort of infantilization that John is sort of prescribing, I guess we can say. He has scheduled every moment. He has taken all control from the narrator, his wife, the patient, and is now, controlling every moment. Yet we see, she feels basically ungrateful. And here's where, in the story, the emotions start to really churn. And she starts to get angry with John. I'm unreasonably angry with him, she says. I used to never be so sensitive. But it leads us to another one of the textual binaries. And this is text and reader. And along with the notion of doctor-patient, I just want to emphasize that the binary text and reader is one of the most important elements, I guess, of narrative medicine, in that its aim is to heighten physicians' abilities to interpret text, to judge whether that narrator is really reliable, right? Every patient who sits before you has a story to tell, and the really truly skilled physician can hear what the patient is saying and what the patient is refraining from saying, and be able to make skillful readings or interpretations of the objective evidence that comes from, say, taking the blood pressure or getting lab work done, but also more subjective data that isn't as obvious. So in this story, the husband misreads the text of his wife and patient. And then if we flip that around, we have the narrator who's reading the text of the wallpaper. This wallpaper that has become such an obsession is a text for her. She gets down on the corner of the ground and tries to follow it and trace every little turn and convolution in its pattern. And just as she's doing that, we, the reader, are trying to read the narrator's text. The only one in this mix who's absolutely confident about his reading is the husband doctor, who's got it dead wrong, unfortunately. So in the story, Gilman says, if a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there's really nothing the matter but a temporary nervous depression, that was her actual diagnosis, a slight hysterical tendency. What is one to do? Gilman's diagnosis, not the narrator. What is one to do? There's this overwhelming feeling of helplessness. And she even fictionalizes a physician brother also, as if to throw in a second opinion. My brother says the same thing. There's nothing really wrong with me, but I can feel, I know there's something wrong with me, she's saying. And it is this doubt of the physician's doubt of the patient's certainty that is so particularly painful to her in this situation. And she says, personally, I disagree with their ideas. She might say, I disagree with their readings. I disagree with their interpretations of my condition. Personally, I believe that the congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. I did write for a while in spite of them, but it does exhaust me a good deal, having to be so sly about it. She doesn't want to disobey the prescription, this narrator in the story. She doesn't want to go against her husband's wishes and disregard his professional opinion. But the repetition here of the adverb and the first person pronoun, I disagree, I believe, she's starting to get a little bit more indignant and a little bit more frustrated in the story. So as she begins reading the wallpaper in the room that she's in, we start to see more of the correlation between John's infantilization of his patient wife and the setting and the paper itself that are so such obsessions to her. It's a nursery, right, and then a playroom, a gymnasium. The windows are barred, just like in a prison. There's a gate at the top of the stairs. There's rings and things in the wall that kind of, I don't know, conjures up an image of a dungeon or something. There's an immovable bed. Well, where do they have immovable beds? Prisons, asylums. I never saw a worse paper in my life. And then the emotional pitch gets a bit higher. Sprawling, flamboyant patterns, every artistic sin. Dull enough to confuse the eye in following. Pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. That is very much like we feel as we're reading this text and trying to follow this increasingly incoherent, less lucid narrator. Repellent color. Then the paper itself is personified. It seems as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. And then she sees this skulking figure behind it, a figure creeping about like a child, and she sees it as a woman. And she begins to read the woman behind the paper as a version of herself. She's trying to interpret this woman's movements. What is she trying to escape from, and why can't she escape? How can I help her escape? Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, she says, as if this wallpaper and the hallucinations she's experiencing are indicative of all of Victorian women's conditions. They're all kind of locked in this uncomfortable domestic sphere that prohibits them from any kind of artistic creation, any kind of work or living or purpose outside the home. And then there's this interesting moment that several scholars have noted where the pronouns are kind of conflated here. I pulled and she shook. I shook and she pulled, and before morning we peeled off yards of that paper. There's sort of a fusion moment between the narrator and this hallucination, this imprisoned version of herself that she's reading in the text. And with the peeling off of all the yards of paper, we have sort of like this final unraveling of her psyche. She's truly lost it by this point and has regressed into the creeping child. So as this final binary to look at, Jeffrey Berman says that, and I like this, the chaotic pattern symbolizes her own unheard emotional contradictions, her need for security, yet her fear of dependency and entrapment, her acceptance of the American dream amidst the nightmare of reality, her passive acceptance of duty, but rising protest. And what is he describing here but yet another set of binaries that the author / narrator is exploring in this chaotic pattern. The narrator is trying to work it out, but the narrator goes insane. The author, whose autobiographical elements are interwoven into this text, remains firmly in control of her story. She emerges on the other end quite intact, and all the better for having written this story. The narrator, we don't know what becomes of her except that she is truly insane by the end. So there's been this long history of thinkers who are proponents of using emotional self-disclosure as a means of healing. And it goes on before Freud with Janet and Charcot, and through WHR Rivers in World War I, that's Abram Gardner, Lenore Walker, who's done a lot of work with rape victims and trauma of domestic violence. And of course, the man with the pen in his hand here is James Pennebaker, whose research I follow closely because he, as a young psychologist, noted the physiological changes that occurred as he was doing a study on polygraph subjects undergoing lie detector tests that have all these electrodes and things hooked up to them. He noticed that their blood pressure would build and they would perspire and really be completely bound up in this lie of whatever it was, whatever crime they were trying to get out of. But if they confessed, all of those physical changes were great improvements. Your blood pressure went down, you stopped sweating as much, your heart rate was lowered, et cetera, et cetera. So he wondered, can I apply this to writing? And he's sort of the one who, through University of Texas, began all these clinical experiments with reflective writing and examining how it can either heal or keep one well. And when I say heal, I don't mean this great curative kind of healing that wipes out, terrible disease. Wouldn't that be great? But certainly a restorative kind of healing, a release, as we've said, a catharsis that has been shown to do some of those very same things. Lower blood pressure, improve spirometry tests in asthma patients, boost immune systems as measured by laboratory tests, and a whole host of other things. There are gobs and gobs of clinical trials about reflective writing with different conditions. So, but it's all based on this notion that if we actively suppress some kind of emotion, or if someone is making us actively suppress emotions, then it makes us sick. So what's his methodology, Pennebaker? You can try this on your own. You write without stopping for at least 15 minutes a day, 4 days in a row. You don't worry about spelling. You don't worry about punctuation. None of that. You just put your pen on the paper and you write for 15 solid minutes. If you can go longer, great. But at least 15 minutes a day, 4 days in a row. He says, what do you do with your writing after that? He said a lot of people keep it and revise it, so they change it as time goes on, or they may refer back to it from time to time to see how they were feeling at this point in their life. He said, but here's some other things that you can do with it. Shred it, burn it, eat it, not recommended. He says, just get rid of it. It's out there, it's gone. You've addressed those feelings and now you don't have to deal with them again. Is there risk in this kind of writing? Sure. Good question. And they have done studies with that, and you absolutely can use a keyboard if you wish. I think I would urge pen and paper first because it slows you down. You really have to slow down and think when you're using that old-fashioned implement. Whereas some of us can kind of put our heads back and close our eyes and just go to town on the keyboard. You really want to engage with the emotions that you're trying to get in touch with. Is this writing risky? It can be. If it can heal you, then certainly it can be risky for you. Pennebaker says it may make you feel bad, like you've seen a really sad movie. For a couple of hours, maybe even a day or two, you may feel bad after having written and disclosed some of these things. But, you know, more often than not, there are no side effects to this, and you know, the benefits certainly outweigh it. The only exception is in trauma studies, which I will get to briefly if I have time here in just a second. So what do you write about? Something you're thinking or worrying about too much, like that huge exam that determines your future at the University of Florida. Something that you're constantly dreaming about. Do you have recurring dreams? Tackle that in writing. Something that's affecting your life in an unhealthy way, like a bad relationship or, you know, too much booze on the weekends. Or something that you've been avoiding for days, weeks, or years, like, I don't know, a terrible family event that you just haven't been able to face, maybe a bad fight with a friend or something from years ago. What do we learn through this kind of writing? How to name our thoughts and emotions and recognize gradations. Saying I'm angry doesn't mean anything if that's all I say, and it's certainly different from when I feel annoyed or when I feel incensed. There are different kinds of anger. If you learn how to name them and put them on paper, it helps you work through them better. You learn how to identify what triggers them, what buttons are being pushed when you feel this way, how to vent them on the page, and that this process of naming and identifying the process helps you process the chaotic thinking. If you're stressed out or you're frightened about something, you know how your thoughts just fly in your mind, and you have to kind of slow down and think about them and pin them down. And then when you are able to externalize it on the page, you can just neutralize some of the stress and the intrusive thoughts that you're having. Now, in situations of trauma, and I'm not suggesting that Gilman is portraying any kind of trauma necessarily in the Yellow WallPaper. She did have plenty of trauma in her own life and even trauma in her pregnancy. But you know, just as a way of helping you understand something that we are learning about the brain here with reflective writing. When trauma occurs, your brain is flooded with neurohormones that affect the way that memories are laid down and subsequently retrieved. So we can't, with PTSD patients, for example, they can't retrieve the memories in a coherent narrative fashion the way that we can, you know, talk about the great party we had for 4th of July this weekend. They're walled off or fragmented, they're disintegrated, and they're qualitatively different from the normal memories that we lay down in these parts of the brain. But when we can process memories in this kind of writing, and trauma is something being studied frequently with relationship to reflective writing now, we find that we can collect these fragments of memories and reconnect them, sort of like putting a puzzle together, making the memory whole again. And we can, again, identify inaccurate or unreasonable thoughts about the trauma, and we can begin to link and blend the memory, the newly reformed memory, to adaptive thoughts and emotions that can help us work our way out of traumatic stress, for example. Again, it's an expression, a releasing of distressing emotions. So when we begin to express rather than suppress, we can start to heal. It's a psychological confrontation, that's what Pennebaker calls it, of your fears, stressors, or traumatic memories. And here again, slowing down the thinking to write it down. If you do use a keyboard, I would just go slowly, go at a considered pace. Think about the words as you write them down. And here, it's pressing the writer to recall and acknowledge current objective and subjective details. This is important. This is what makes it reflective writing different from just your general diary entry. If we write in a diary, we can write all subjective data. Oh, I'm so mad, I'm so angry, and just go on and on and on about this feeling, right? Or conversely, we can write about objective details. I woke up at 8 o'clock, I ate scrambled eggs and toast, I drove to the gym, etc. What reflective writing is nudging the writer to do is to think about the objective details and the way you felt when whatever happened was going on. How did you feel then, and how do you feel now that this event or stressful time or trauma, if that's what it is in the past? So you're trying to do some dual hemisphere work. You know, you're engaging the analytical side on the left and the emotional side on the right, and you're trying to speak the unspeakable, express the inexpressible in a safe forum, which is the page. So, writing with purpose, Gilman's grand cause in life. She did indeed achieve some pretty profound goals, I guess, purposes with this story. She claims to have helped at least one woman avoid the same fate, and when her family read the story and returned her to normal activity as opposed to this enforced bed rest, that she recovered and did fine. Another great purpose, and the purpose of the story, she said in one place, was to make Silas Weir Mitchell rethink the bed rest, this cure. She sent him a copy of the story. He never acknowledged it, but she claims in her autobiography that she learned many years later that he had revised some of the methods of the rest cure as a result of reading the story. Don't know if that's true, but that's what she says in her autobiography. She said it was not intended to drive people crazy. That was not the purpose of the Yellow Wallpaper, as a lot of traditional Victorian readers thought at the time, but to save people from being crazy. And I read in that second people to save myself from being crazy. And it worked. So I'll leave you with a quote from Rita Sharon at Columbia, who reminds us that narrative does things for us. It certainly is inexpensive. Anyone can do it. Accessible everywhere, anytime. It's clinically proven to benefit the writer. And it's useful to the physician, too, but I think that I'll have to leave for another talk or maybe my next book. But thank you very much for coming. Any questions that I can answer for anyone?